But what we're going to talk about today is essentially this question of how do decision makers at colleges and universities actually decide what educational technologies, products, and trends or strategies you acquire and use at your institutions. So it seems really simple, but it's actually kind of complicated. And the study itself was actually a part of this EdTech Efficacy Research Academic Symposium, which Matthew had mentioned briefly, that we took part in earlier this year, where the main goal of the symposium was to try and understand the role of efficacy research in the development and implementation and also evaluation of EdTech products and tools. And specifically, one piece that I think we found very interesting is this question of what is the role of research in particular, as and whether or not it's evidence that can help us make evidence-based decisions when it comes to EdTech products. And so some of the things that we were trying to focus on, so it was actually very broad, the symposium, so it was looking sort of all across K through 12 as well as higher education, but we focused specifically on higher education. And we tried to really get into where does actual information come from that we can make decisions based on. Trying to provide some transparency in terms of the decision-making processes that occur. Identifying some best practices, and then of course, I think collaboration is something that's really important when thinking about all the different stakeholders in the EdTech space. And these are all the people who are part of the working group, so you can see it wasn't just me, there was actually a lot of people that were part of this. Matthew was a part of a separate working group, and he also was a participant in our study, so you'll be seeing some of his quotations coming on pretty soon. So I think one of the things that we have to sort of ask ourselves or get into is this question of when we talk about evidence-based decision-making or we speak about this idea of research, what exactly do we mean? So very interestingly, it's not very obvious. I think a lot of people think about research and evidence in a lot of different ways. And there's kind of a whole background to the motivation for thinking about evidence-based decision-making in EdTech. So over the past couple of decades, there's been actually quite a lot of, I think, consensus towards, trying to push towards evidence-based decision-making in education. And sort of with the things like No Child Left Behind and ESSA legislation, there is some mandated legislation and frameworks to help us understand what that means in the context of K through 12. But there's actually no such mandate in higher education, right? So what exactly do we mean by evidence-based decision-making? What is a framework for thinking about how we can actually approach it? There's also a lot of literature that tries to look at what do we mean by research and what actually counts as evidence. And a lot of what they find is that actually there's very little consensus. So when you ask decision makers or you even ask researchers, what do we mean? Their definitions will be wildly different. But the definitions that do exist actually tend to create this model, which is kind of in a perfect world where you'll have a researcher who's kind of working on producing this externally produced evidence that then gets turned over to the decision maker who uses it to make decisions, right? So it seems very linear and very nice and neat, but in practice we know that this is not how it works. And there's a lot of documentation that decision makers face a lot of constraints when it comes to thinking about both how you find, interpret, and also use evidence for decision making. I think in the case of EdTech, a lot of that has to do with things like time horizons. Also the dearth of rigorous research that actually exists, right? So if you want to know whether or not something works and you try to look for a study on it, that study probably doesn't exist, right? Or if there are studies that do exist, they oftentimes are not very relevant to the particular population or the institutional context that you're working in. But there is some evidence that involving stakeholders in actually designing and implementing locally relevant research actually can increase the likelihood that the findings that are used are more likely to be integrated into decision making. So we wanted to get a better understanding of how this works, specifically in the context of EdTech acquisition and higher education. So what did we do? We did a qualitative study where we conducted semi-structured interviews with 52 EdTech decision makers in higher education. And so these were all people who had roles where they were participating in making decisions about the acquisition and use of educational technologies for the purposes of teaching and learning. So it's a lot of administrators, CIOs, presidents, and we also had some academics, including provosts. And so what did we ask them? We asked a lot of open-ended questions that were related to where do you actually get your information, right? So how do you actually learn about EdTech products and strategies and trends that are out there? We asked people to focus very specifically on a recent decision that they made and actually walk us through the process of how that decision making occurred. And then we spent a lot of time actually focusing on this idea of the role of research. And this is what I'll focus primarily on. But we asked questions like, what constitutes research for decision makers? So what do you actually think is a definition of research? How do you use research in decision making? And also whether or not your particular institution is conducting investigations to try to understand whether or not the EdTech products that you have are working. So what did we learn? We learned a few things. So one is, and this is very specific to when they were talking through a specific decision, but we did ask, what is the goal that you were trying to achieve with whatever EdTech decision you're describing right now. So this table just gives you sort of a list of all the possible things that people mentioned, and also the percentage of interviews in which a particular goal is mentioned. So the most commonly mentioned was supporting a variety of pedagogical and assessment models or strategies. I think it's not surprising. A lot of things related to operational efficiencies or cost reductions, or increasing capacity to serve students. I think one thing that a lot of people brought up in our symposium that they found potentially alarming is how few people actually talked about improving outcomes for students as a goal for EdTech. So I think in a lot of ways there's this disconnect between what we're trying to do with EdTech in terms of trying to solve some immediate needs related to potentially operational efficiencies, cost reductions, and what's our big goal in institutions of higher education in terms of being able to actually move the needle on student learning. And trying to figure out how to bridge that gap, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. So there is a lot of skepticism, I think, that comes from what really is EdTech doing, right? We're very excited about it. It's super policy relevant. Here in the United States also I've seen major trends all across the globe in terms of a lot of education decision makers trying to bring in EdTech as the solution to all of the problems that we've been facing in education. And so this is just a quotation from one of our interviewees, Philip Long, who's at the University of Texas at Austin. And so he's saying, one of the concerns I have is the presumption that the solutions to pedagogical problems can be found with the right selection of educational technologies. So he's saying, I don't buy that, right? He's saying, there's this idea that we can solve these problems by coming up with a mechanism to make the right tool selection and give you the right checklist. But he thinks this is not only fallacious, but dangerous. Right? So it's this idea that we have all of these age-old problems in education that we've been trying to solve for a very long time. And here comes EdTech, and we think it's the solution. So we start with all of these tools that we're really excited about, and we think we can fit these tools to these problems. And that if we just create the right checklist, that at the end of the day, this is going to sort of be the silver bullet that maybe we haven't found before. But maybe this is kind of overestimating the capacity of what EdTech can actually do. So, then we have to ask, well, how do decisions actually get made in higher education? So there is actually a lot of literature on this, and there's a couple of competing models about how decisions get made in higher education. So one of them is this idea of the garbage can model, which is that there are all these solutions that are flying around, kind of in space, and they land in this trash can, right, or this garbage can, and we start picking up the solutions and thinking like, oh, what kind of a problem can I solve with this solution? Right? And so this is, it's a relatively old idea. It was from Cohen, March, and Olson from 1972. But it's something that people are often thinking about as this happening in terms of institutions of higher education decision making. And this stands in contrast to this idea of a rational decision making model, which we would all like to believe is actually how things happen, but it's probably not. Right? But in a rational decision making model, in a sort of simplistic way, we would think that first we identify a problem that we're facing. Right? So like student access to learning. And then we think about potential solution options. And then we think, what are the criteria that I'm going to use to evaluate these options? I'll evaluate my options, I'll decide if it works or it doesn't work, and then I'll end up with a solution that perfectly solves my problem. Right? So these are kind of two opposing sides of the spectrum in terms of how decision making works. My guess is that it's probably a little bit of both, right, in higher education. And it may be the case that it's neither one or the other, but it's something to give us a thought about how are we actually approaching the decision-making process, And what are some frameworks that we can think about to try to make sure that we're asking the right questions and moving in the right direction? So this was a sentiment that actually came up in our interviews. So this is a quotation from one of our interviewees, Ron Hutchins, from the University of Virginia. And he's saying that technology in and of itself is useless unless it's in support of the business of the university. Right? So to me, this is one of the things that we miss on a continual basis. We don't actually start with the business of education. We start with this idea of like, here's a tool. Right? And so he's saying it's kind of like that old adage where you say, bring me a rock. And you're like, oh, this isn't the rock I want. Bring me another one. Until you finally find something that is shiny and exciting that you decide that you want to keep. Right? But the idea is, you know, this is a danger in EdTech that maybe we're starting with tools rather than starting with real needs and an understanding of the problems that we're really trying to solve and whether or not EdTech actually fits into that. So here's a polling question for you. Where do you think Duke actually fits in the spectrum of needs versus tools? So you can see if you can get on.
I think that garbage can is my email inbox that
Oh, really?
is where I think we are.
Yeah, I think it probably resonates, right? This idea of the garbage can model. So see if you can, do you think you start primarily towards tools or somewhat, or towards needs, or is it somewhere in the middle? Sorry, my Likert scale is actually messed up, but just choose whichever one. I don't know how I got switched. These are anonymous, by the way, so you know, in case you're afraid to say. Should I stop polling in 10, 9, 8, 7? Is anyone still having trouble getting on, or are we all on now? 6, 5, we're good. Okay, let's see what people say. Interesting. So it's definitely in the middle, right? It's all three of the middle options. Somewhat towards tools, somewhere in the middle, somewhere towards needs. Is there, like, does anyone have, want to say anything about what they chose? Like why you chose the option that you did?
I chose somewhere in the middle because I'm thinking about like 3 new projects, and one I know started with a need, and one said, hey, that's a cool tool. Just, there seems to be mostly balance.
Of both, right? Both. Yeah. And how did you find out about the tool versus the need? Like how did
I don't know, that wasn't my preference.
Oh, it got like, it got handed to you.
I mean, the one thing that we're doing is the what is it called?
I notice how you're directed.
Yes, because you're the tools guy.
What have I done to you?
No, this is not actually an accusation.
Which project?
The Nudge.
Ah.
Nudge is kind of a tool that we
Yeah.
found was interesting. I'm currently looking for virtual stuff because we need to solve something. Virtual language lab is because we
Right.
need to solve a need.
Right, so we didn't have faculty or a group of faculty come to us and
Right.
say, we need really quick assessment tools
Right.
that students can answer to subvert the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. We heard a pitch about a tool that seemed like it would meet a need that we don't hear about, but we assume is there, and then we move forward with technology decisions and projects around trying to
See if
justify that assumption and see if it is valid.
Actually a need, yeah. I mean, that's very common, right? When it comes to the actual practice of making these decisions, is that it can happen a lot of different ways. And I don't know necessarily if there's one way or the other, it's just the fact of the matter that this is how it is. But given that, I think one thing is just to be very critical about, so then what does that mean about what we do with these different kinds of options that get put onto our plate? And are there certain types of questions that we could potentially be asking that could help us to make the decision-making process more rigorous? So there is kind of this idea of a best practice that came from Ron Hutchins when he was talking about this tools versus needs tension. And he talks about this idea of cycling between tools and needs, right? That if I'm trying to identify the need, then I have to actually select technologies that are going to solve that need, but then I need to know what technologies exist. So it's not enough to just go out and do a bunch of needs assessments and know that your students are, not reaching whatever kind of learning level you want them to, or that they have problems with access, or that there are other kinds of issues that you're facing. But you need to know what kinds of solutions are out there. So then the question becomes, where do EdTech decision makers actually get their information? So how do we learn about these technologies and products and trends? And how does that potentially inform our ability to, make good decisions? So this is one more polling question for you. So which of the following, so we actually asked this question. We asked people where they get information on EdTech products and strategies. So which of the following do you think, just choose one, which do you think was the most frequently consulted source of information related to making decisions about acquiring and using educational technology? So is it vendors? Is it research or technical assistance centers, professional associations or consortia, foundations, consultants, colleagues, or other?
You want the real answer or the cynical answer?
Well, we have an answer that we got from our study. I don't know if it's true or not.
Okay, yeah.
You should say whatever you want, yeah. Which one are you putting? Are you going to put the real one?
Yeah, the real.
Will you tell me the cynical one?
Well, at first, A, maybe the vendors, I feel like. Maybe that's not cynical, maybe that's realistic. We'll see.
I really don't know.
Oh my god, we've got 12 people participating. Let's see what everyone thinks. Okay, so 8% said vendors, 17% said research or technical assistance centers. So as the researcher, I want to say thank you. Professional associations or consortia, and 50% said colleagues. So, if you want to know what people actually said, the good news is that you know the EdTech space, because the number one was definitely colleagues. So I think first, maybe one point to make is that people said a whole lot of stuff. And what this is recording is just the percentage of interviews in which one or more of these sources of categories was mentioned. So we asked very openly, like, where do you get information? And people said, oh, I talked to my friend at like Southern New Hampshire, or I talked to this person at University of Virginia. And we noted down all of these things, and then we actually just looked at what everybody said and in how many different interviews all of these things were mentioned. In 96% of the interviews, people mentioned colleagues, either at their own institution or at other institutions. So if you're trying to learn about EdTech products and strategies, we're asking our friends. That's the number one thing we're doing. A lot of people are getting information from vendors, so 80% did say that. Professional associations or consortia, I think, is not surprising. Only 9% said research or technical assistance centers. I don't know necessarily what to make of that, because on the one hand, I think, maybe it just means it's not relevant. Or maybe that's not where you look for this information because it's not helpful. Maybe we don't know what's out there that could be useful. Or maybe we just think other things are better for helping us make our decisions, Foundations were also mentioned 4% of the time. But I think one of the other things to note is that in each of these categories, hardly anything was mentioned more than twice. So we interviewed 52 EdTech decision makers, and in each category, we got something like 100 different things. So we had like over 100 different colleagues mentioned as their source. And maybe, so Matthew, you were mentioned, but like twice. And so there were a lot of, so it's there is kind of this sense that like people are asking their friends, right? And the same thing even for vendors or professional associations. I think probably EduCause was the only thing that was really mentioned like a lot of times. It was mentioned in like 20 of the interviews. But otherwise, everybody was saying stuff that was like, the spread of the number of things that was mentioned was pretty high. And where are people actually getting the information? So they're getting it from their friends, from vendors, from consultants and associations. And most of them are getting it at networks, events, or conferences, right? So if I'm trying to find out about something, I go to EduCause or ASU GSV or the Online Learning Consortium. And probably a lot of you guys probably go to that every year, these events, right? 91% actually said written publications, so things like the Chronicle of Higher Education or the EDUCAUSE Review. And I didn't put this percentage here, but it was a very small percent that mentioned peer-reviewed journals. So I think EDUCAUSE is kind of a blend, right? The EDUCAUSE Review, like some of it's peer-reviewed and some of it's not. But I think a lot of these are more like practitioner publications, right? So it's not necessarily the most scientifically rigorous studies that you've seen, but maybe these are the things that are more helpful for decision making. And then 89% says social media and online communications, or where we find out about stuff on Twitter. It's a very important place. So yeah, so there's kind of this idea that, you know, institutions of higher education are mostly talking to other institutions of higher education, and this is just a quote from the Chief Academic Technology Officer at ASU. So he's saying, I talked to CIOs at other universities, and there's kind of this idea, right, that if they've tried some ed tech that they're considering, higher ed is this near follower industry, right? So we kind of want to see if other people are doing it, and that's a huge part of the motivation or the impetus for us also making decisions to do something. And if they see that people, that things that people are doing have worked for someone else, then they jump in. I think one of the questions though is like, what do we mean by worked? So there is, and I won't get into this very much right now in this presentation, but I'm happy to discuss maybe afterwards, but how we define whether or not something is working, I think is a huge part of what we need to ask ourselves in decision making. Like, do we mean that we can actually make statements about causal attribution? Or do we mean that we're seeing things change over time? We're not actually sure whether or not it's our ed tech product or not. Do we mean that students are happy or they're more engaged, but maybe they're not necessarily learning more, right? So there's actually a lot of studies that have shown that ed tech is really good at increasing engagement, and I'm talking RCTs. Really good at getting kids to actually start using things that they weren't using before, or different kinds of students. But oftentimes, unless it's designed in exactly the right way, it won't actually lead to increases in learning. And so these are all things that we have to really think about when we're asking ourselves whether or not something is working, right? So where does the role of research actually fit into all of this? So we actually asked, because there is, and actually you can pass this out because I think it might be hard for you to read, and there's a lot of options, so I gave them all to you here. But we asked people, in your opinion, what counts as research? And this is what people said. So it's a lot of options. I think, again, I would note there was nothing that was mentioned in more than 40% of the interviews. But the most commonly mentioned thing was conducting student, staff, and faculty interviews, surveys, or focus groups about ed tech issues. So that's probably something we might use to try to understand needs, right? Looking at student outcomes after implementing an ed tech strategy or product. It's indicative, it probably doesn't tell you anything about impact. Participating in site visits. So this is something that's very commonly done, right? Is like going to your sister institution that's doing something similar, where you have the sense that maybe what their institutional context is similar to yours. You see how it's working in their context, probably more related to implementation than outcomes. And if you're seeing something positive there, then that gives you some reason to think that it will work in your context as well. There's some things related to reading vendors, provided information. And some people are actually conducting investigations at their own research centers or conducting comparison sites in which students or teachers are using ed tech products and strategies, comparison studies. So one thing that we tried to do, so there's a lot of different options here, right? One thing that we tried to do was to ask ourselves, are these internally or externally produced? And there's actually a pretty wide spread. But you can see that there's a lot of internal research that's actually happening in institutions of higher education to try to get at understanding whether or not things are working. So then we tried to understand a little bit better, you know, how are people using it? They're using it for a variety of different activities. But when we really talked about sort of using external research, a lot of interviewees talked about not really having relevance, right? That there isn't much relevant published research on how well ed tech products are working to improve teaching and learning. And there's a lot of reasons, right? One is that it's hard to keep pace with ed tech change, right? So this is a big thing when it comes to RCTs, or other kinds of super rigorous research might take 1 to 2 years to run the study. And by then, the products that you're testing have already become obsolete. So the idea of actually investing a lot of money to do a rigorous study becomes, it just doesn't seem like it makes sense. And then there's just this idea of relevance, right? That there's different contexts and different study populations, and if I'm seeing an RCT that's conducted in somebody else's institution, it may or may not actually be relevant to mine. But then one of the things that we sort of discovered is that, and a part of this actually is this idea that when you're looking at really rigorous research, it's very rare that a product or strategy is actually evaluated in a peer-reviewed journal, right? So this is a quotation from Judy Gehring, who's at the University of Virginia. She's kind of making this point that we don't really look to what we would call scientifically rigorous research to try to understand whether or not a particular product or tool is working, because you probably won't find that study in a peer-reviewed journal. But instead, what we're oftentimes trying to do is look for the rationale, or what you'd think of as like the mechanism, or the underlying causal chain for why something might lead to a particular outcome that you care about. So you might find evidence that things like active learning or digital portfolios are working, but then that puts a lot of onus on the decision maker to have to draw inferences about whether or not something is relevant, right? So she's saying a lot of times we have to connect the dots between what we know about pedagogy and what the tools can actually do. So if I'm trying to make a decision about like a personalized learning software, I might not be able to find, some kind of peer-reviewed study that's actually been done on it, but I'll try to find something that says something about the mechanisms that I think might actually be present in this personalized learning software that might give me a sense that it could potentially work in my context, right? But then it becomes like, that's a lot of work, right? And then we're also left, especially if you don't have a research background, you're left thinking, I don't really know what inferences I can draw, right? So what we found actually is that internal research is very common. So 78% of the people we interviewed said that they're doing their own research in their institutions. So it's a variety of different types of studies that they're doing, reviewing student outcomes, asking other IHUs for feedback about products. They might be administering their own student surveys. One thing that was very common was actually running pilots, which is really interesting. And in some cases, they talk about reading scholarly articles or journals. And usually what this was used for were things like, actually, it varied pretty widely in terms of the goals and also the methodological rigor. So in some cases, they might have resulted in a peer-reviewed study, but very rare, right? So what this means is that the majority of institutions are spending money doing pilots in their own context and not telling anybody about it, which is also a little bit strange because everybody's talking to everybody. But there's kind of this idea that there's all this research that's happening. Maybe we don't feel like anything that's happening over there is relevant, so I've got to do it in my own context. And I'm left here by myself trying to figure out whether or not it's working. And the results are oftentimes used for continuous improvement of instruction, and also deciding whether to continue or scale things up. But then there becomes this big question, right? So if we think of this external versus internal research issue of, maybe it's the case, not always, that external research maybe is more, it's third party, it could be more scientifically rigorous, but it might not be that relevant. But on the other hand, there's, what I can do in my own context that I can cater to my particular population is really gonna help me answer the questions that I care about. So there's this trade-off between rigor and relevance. But then the question becomes what kind of inferences can we draw from these studies, right? So if I'm running a pilot in my context, this can actually be very useful for thinking about implementation, but it's not going to tell me anything about student learning, unless I have a comparison group and unless I'm really thinking about how I can make some kind of statement about impact. And so there's certain things that we can learn, but not everything. This is Matthew's quotation. But one of the things that I think came up is this, as I mentioned, kind of this attention to methodology and rigor. And I think what I love about this quotation is this idea of, at the end of the day, what are we really doing if we don't have credible information that we can rely on, right? So it's about independence and it's about methodology. Who's doing it and what methods are they using? So, personalized learning, which is something that I was interested in, will come and go. But are you using methodologies that are reliable and unbiased and able to bring an objective perspective to the study, right? So at the end of the day, it's kind of like, we can spend a lot of money doing something that's indicative, but we want to be able to make statements, particularly if you're going to invest a lot of money into scaling something up We want to be able to make credible statements about whether or not we have confidence that the things that we're investing in are actually moving the needle on student learning. And this is something that we really have to consider when we're thinking about where are we getting our information and how are we making our decisions. So this is just like open questions, right? So I guess for all of you, what helps you more in making decisions? Local evidence like pilots at your institution or rigorous studies like RCTs conducted elsewhere? So how many of you actually participate in making decisions related to educational technologies? Sort of, or yes. So what do you turn to? Are you more likely, if you are going to use research as a part of your decision-making process, however you define that, are you more likely to find things like pilots to be more helpful? Or do you look to RCTs or other kinds of rigorous studies and journals?
So pilots usually, but also I think we like to draw on research, but I would agree with, I think maybe even Matthew's quote where he talks about research, or maybe it's a person from Virginia, but the research based on other things, on new types of learning or teaching approaches, not research on the tools themselves.
Yeah.
So I think I've made this point to other people before, but like, yeah, research on specific tools, it takes so long to get that stuff published. Like if you're doing the real research and getting it peer reviewed, by the time you get it published, like that wave is already crested, right? And so like the school's either decided to get on that boat or not, or maybe there's actually a lingering need and you are still looking at it, but the tools have totally changed. So the landscape could be totally different. Like some of these tools only last like a year or two if they don't gain any traction, right? The company folds. So you can't really wait for really well-defined research for all of these things.
Yeah.
For big decisions, sure, right? But then I think that's where it comes into play, like what problem you're trying to solve, which I think is a great point. If you start there with some vendors, even they can't answer that, right? They're like more like, we had a cool idea. Here's the idea we're running with, but we know nothing about what happens at a university, right?
Yeah. Cool. Any other thoughts on what's more useful?
So I'm not sure that I can really classify Gartner as a research clinical trial, but I mean, definitely get some information from them. And I feel like when we do some pilots around here, it's a specific product that we're trying, not an evaluation of several, to see how they affect learning. So it's more of a targeted implementation of whether it's going to work. Is that fair?
I agree with that.
You know, so we've kind of partially made a decision on a tool, and we're going to pilot to see whether that works, not necessarily to get an outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think defining what pilot means is pretty critical. So in our process, something we like to do is we just call it an exploration, but that's where you would actually look at the space in a very small group. It's usually just our team, which is not a perfect method by any means, but that's where we would say adaptive learning, and then figure out what the top tools for the contexts we're aware of could be, and then you would move to, okay, let's pilot a single tool, because the bandwidth of personnel, faculty, students, and staff to do pilot on 5 tools, or I mean, that's a lot to ask.
Yeah, and how do you identify what the top tools are?
Through very rigorous RCT.
We did do an adaptive learning exploration, which
try
is
to
a good
develop a
good way to
rubric based
describe.
upon the space. I mean, every
Yeah.
rubric would be different, and it's not the same complete rubric that you would use for like procurement or anything, right? I mean, because there's so many moving parts to actually getting a tool implemented. It's very much on what we think would make it the best. I mean, it's not perfect by any means.
Yeah, I mean, decision making is not a perfect science, right? I think there's a lot of discussion about, okay, so when we go and we do impact evaluation and we're being able to make a causal claim and we have an identification strategy and there's this whole economics behind it, then we call this rigorous science. But everything that happens after that it's an art. And I think trying to understand how to put all of these pieces together is the big challenge. And there isn't necessarily a right answer. I think like for me as a researcher, it's really useful to know, like, is it even, I just spent all this time like doing all these RCTs, like, is that even helpful for decision making? You know, that's the, at least I care about that, not all economists do. But, you know, I think really being able to understand, like, you know, how can we produce information that's useful for the types of questions that we want to be able to answer. And I think, like, for you in the context of things like pilots, that's giving us a lot of information about implementation that actually is really useful. And that's probably the best way you can get that information. But there are other questions that you might want to be able to answer that can't provide the answers that you need. Here's another question for you. Is why don't we do more comparison studies in higher ed? I don't know. Are these things that you think about doing, but you are facing barriers to doing it? Do we not find it relevant? Are they happening and we're not talking about it and people forgot to mention them in the interviews? Or also possible.
Like piloting 2 tools rather than 1, is that what you're saying? Or
So
what do you
no,
mean by
more thinking about. So I remember. So that is actually a really great point. And we had a little section in our report on piloting, and it's one thing that Matthew had mentioned was this idea of piloting 2 tools at the same time. So in that case, you're thinking about you don't want that tool to be compared to nothing, right? Because doing something is usually better than nothing. But you want to actually be making a decision between a variety of solution options. But here it's like, if I want to know whether or not this program that I've already decided to invest in and that I've been spending money on for the last 1 to 2 years is moving the needle on student learning, then I need to have some kind of a comparison group that's not receiving that intervention, where I can make some kind of a statement about whether or not this group is doing better than that group. And there's a lot of challenges to doing that, right? But I think it's not happening as often as it could be. And I mean, this is just kind of a question, like, I'm interested from a research perspective. You know, why don't we do more comparison studies? Yeah.
If you mean the comparison studies as true experimental randomized trial studies, I think in education it's very hard to do that. And you have to ensure that students don't talk to each other or those kind of things. And in online education, I think technically it's difficult. And in Coursera, they just enabled the experiment A/B test studies, but technically they are not perfect because students in different sessions, they can switch. So I think technically and operationally it's very difficult, and that's why I think there are not as many as there should be.
Yeah, online learning is like its own challenge, right? In terms of trying to come up with a comparison group. Because what are you even comparing it to?
Mm-hmm.
Is it the exact same student in the exact same situation, but now they're getting the same curriculum but online versus face-to-face? Or is it that student who's like the distance learning student who wouldn't come to school at all if we didn't provide it to them online? So it's like even that question is very challenging. Was someone over here going to say something?
I was going to piggyback on what you said by stating the fact that many schools, departments who make EdTech decisions don't even have people on staff who could say what you just said. Therefore, can't even comprehend actually completing a comparison study. Like they don't have that background. They don't. And
They'd say do an A/B test, and they would say like, well, maybe there's problems.
yeah, they wouldn't know, right? I mean, they don't have a research. I don't have a research background.
So the capacity issue is like a huge one, right?
Yeah.
And it's one that I think this is something that I think a lot of researchers try to think about is there's one model where you could potentially try to build relationships between external researchers and decision makers, where the researcher's kind of running the study, but the decision makers or the implementers are giving like feedback. And then there's this model where you actually try to build the capacity of local practitioners or implementers on how to do their own studies so that they can do their own studies. And I think, this is something that Fiona, who's the co-author in the study, and I have talked about a lot, is a lot of people lean towards this external, like, just pair a practitioner and implementer with a researcher and let the researcher do the study. But there's really something to be said about building capacity, I think, of the actual people who are doing this to at least be able to do studies that can answer their own questions. So I think all of these are really great points. That's my last question. Oh yeah. Any ideas on how researchers can make their findings more useful? So our report, by the way, is 150 pages. I'll give you the website. You can read it if you feel like it, but I will not be offended if you don't. But this is kind of the thing, right? Is that like we produce these reports, like who wants to read them? I'm only interested because I spent all the time writing it, but probably you don't want to. And are there ways that we can actually make the things that we're doing more useful for EdTech decision makers?
So this is actually, like, everybody has the same problem here, right? Like, I was at a conference, an open standards IMS global conference a couple months ago, and the vendors ran a session saying, we hate having to do the same thing a different way at each one of your schools. Please get your act together and make decision-making essentially a single unified process. And like everyone in the room was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, but yet we don't do it.
It's very hard to do, yeah.
I mean, I don't know why. I mean, we're all scared that when we don't look as good as we should, when we are transparent about our research, we're scared of that. I don't know. I mean,
well, the thing I liked about this report, though, is I mean, you asked a very basic but essential question. Like, do these EdTech tools actually result in better learning? And that's not always the thing that we're looking at, because it takes a long-term study to really figure that out, and we don't always know. And maybe we know that the concept will result in something. Like, we understand that like delivering content through video might be more efficient than having someone live streamed, and so we look at a certain tool that does something, but we have more of a hunch based on some research on that, but we don't have the actual full extent of it. But no one really makes decisions completely based on whether they know for sure that students are learning more or not. And in fact, in the higher ed space, sometimes you might even find a tool that is doing something better, but you end up having to choose the cheaper version of that because of the realities of the higher ed space, right? And that's like sort of sad, but it's kind of like the realities, right? And I think the realities are usually, are you keeping up with the Joneses? Do you have the budget? And then maybe, is it resulting in better learning? Right? And like, I think we all intrinsically hope that what we're doing is resulting in better learning, or there's no reason to even bother. But proving it is really difficult. But it's good I think it's good to have studies like this out there that are continuing to question that, because people forget what their job is about, right? And I know I have a lot of colleagues that make decisions based on a number of other things and then don't ask that question at all. And it's good to be reminded, I mean, at the very least.
Yeah, I want to answer from the communications perspective, because that's what I do here. And I think, taking the 146 page report and making it easier to digest and usable is what I think about. So actionable, like bulleted lists that say, here are 3 things, your BuzzFeed article, here are 3 things you can do to make your EdTech research more effective.
Yeah.
And even you were mentioning trying to build capacity. Go to EdTech conferences and run workshops on how to build capacity. I think people will sign up for those if you go, people don't necessarily not want to do research, but like Michael says, like if you have a session that says, here are a couple of simple ways you can better evaluate your EdTech products or strategies.
I'm going to echo on that. I think also for research published on journals, I think maybe there's a way to write for a general audience in some of the other channels instead of the scientific, nobody wants to read kind of journal format. Yeah, but also there is a challenge because educational research is very complicated. You have the context, you have the student population, you have blah, blah, blah. And if you make that very short, maybe some of the relevant information is missing and people think it's relevant to us, but it's actually not. Like a lot of times I'm attracted to an article that by the title, and then when I click in it, it's not the things that it's said on the title. So I think we can do that, but maybe, there are challenges.
Yeah. I think these are all things that at least I've thought a lot about. Is on the one hand, how can you make the information more digestible, right? So how can you kind of draw the link between this journal article and maybe producing, so one thing I used to do at my old organization was actually produce policy publications of just like trying to make these like really crazy RCTs that were run by economists make sense to practitioners. But then there's also, on the other side, this question of like building capacity, right? And how can we actually give people the ability to either do studies, right, you can produce, but then also this idea of consuming research, like how can we get better at drawing inferences from the information that is out there so that we can just, make the decision-making process a little bit better. So we had like a whole bunch of, kind of what can we learn from this? So a couple of things. So one is externally produced scientifically based research is very rarely used by EdTech decision makers. That's fine. And instead, locally relevant evidence actually seems to be something that a lot of people are using to make their decisions. I found this very interesting because it suggests that in many cases, EdTech decision makers are actually playing the role of both consumer and producer of research. And this actually stands in contrast to a lot of theory about decision-making models where you have these researchers on the one side that are producing and decision makers on the other side that are using. But it's actually this idea, at least in the case of EdTech, and I think for some of the reasons, some of the specific barriers that we might face in using research and decision making, that they're actually playing this role both of the producer and the consumer of the research. But then of course we have this question, which we've been talking about, that there's these trade-offs between rigor and relevance. So a couple of recommendations. So one is, this was just take a walk out of your echo chamber, right? So it's this idea of don't just talk to your friends, but try to actually do a whole bunch of other ways that you can gather information that's going outside of your scope of your everyday learning. And there's a lot of really great, I think, recommendations that were given by people that we interviewed in terms of organizing conferences with startups or really taking efforts to go out and learn sort of what people outside the scope of your everyday are doing. I think one person mentioned that they really liked going to the Lockheed Martin conferences, just because they felt like that was a way that they could learn a lot more than just going and talking to sort of their friends on a daily basis. Increasing collaborations between researchers and decision makers to optimize rigor and use value or relevance. And I think I would lean on the side of actually trying to increase those collaborations so you can build the capacity of decision makers to actually produce their own evidence that's relevant for their decision-making processes. Include comparison groups. As somebody who's spent a lot of time thinking about impact evaluation, this is just please think about when you can do this. Because yes, we sometimes have a lot of other things we have to worry about before we get to this idea of outcomes, but at some point we have to ask about outcomes. And so just not forgetting that that's an important thing. And then I think identifying key questions on what you really need to know and how you can measure it. So I think impact evaluation, or RCTs, or these really rigorous research that's sort of done in peer-reviewed journals, a lot of times that tells us something about impact, right? But we also need to figure out how can we really learn about needs in the right way? How can we actually understand what is the problem that we're dealing with? And what is actually the binding constraint to learning? So sometimes you might see some kind of an observable issue, like the students are lagging behind, or attendance rates are really low, or there are very few students that are engaged in the classroom. But the reason why is not necessarily clear. And the reason why is going to give you the answer to what solution you need. Without it, we're just throwing things in the dark. And really trying to get at, I think, how to answer that question is really important. Pilots can give us a lot of information about implementation, right? So if you can really think systematically about the questions that you have and think, how are we going to get the information that we need, and what kinds of studies or what kinds of knowledge do I need to be able to answer these questions a little bit better? And this is Matthew again. So one of the things that was our big recommendation was this idea of the tiered levels of investment. So RCTs are an appropriate methodology for high stakes investments, where it makes sense to invest a lot of money, right? RCTs cost at minimum $100,000. I've seen RCTs run in developing countries cost millions of dollars. So if we're gonna invest that much money, then it should be for something where the return on investment is gonna be really high, right? But we need to think about an approach that calibrates the appropriate methodology to the level of investment, right? So maybe we don't need to hold everything to this RCT standard, but if there's a certain level of investment in research that's appropriate for a particular product, then we can think about how much we're going to invest to get the information that we need. If it's just a small scale thing that's going to be run here, we don't need to do an RCT. Maybe you can do a pre-post or something else that is a lot more relevant and is a lot more feasible in terms of the scope of the time horizon and also the cost. So I think that's it. We have a report in case you want to read it. There's a short version too. There's a 6-page report and a 150-page report. You can choose. But yeah, any questions? Anything else? Yeah?
How do you see the learning analytics movement playing into these questions of EdTech? Because to me it seems like it's a whole new source of data it's informing decision making about learners, but hasn't necessarily moved into kind of EdTech decision making.
Yeah.
So it's shaping like what happens inside the platforms, but not what platforms should we have.
Yeah.
Like, do you see that as coming, and are there mechanisms for kind of looking at analytics across different platforms and saying making more holistic type decisions?
So I definitely, there are a lot of people that are bringing this up, I think, in conversation. So I'm actually working on a piece with, do you know who Michael Tricano is? He's at the World Bank. He writes about all that. He's like the EdTech person for the World Bank. But he writes about it more in developing country contexts. And so he and a couple of other people were working on this white paper that's related to EdTech, more in a global context. And this idea of learning analytics is, we're actually trying to, the paper's thinking about giving advice to entrepreneurs on how to think about developing EdTech products. And a big part of that is like this idea of like design research, like knowing your customer, but then also using learning analytics to help you better understand whether or not your product is. So it's something that, from our perspective, is like everybody's starting to talk about it. In terms of mechanisms or like platforms to help improve that, I don't know. I think that there are some movements towards trying to figure out how, because how would you do that? It is about getting entrepreneurs and like vendors and the people who are actually developing the products to learn something about learning analytics, right?
And share their data back with you also, because app developers are looking at their own dashboards to see whether their app is working. And universities are building their own dashboards to see whether the students are learning. You'd have to get those talking. And you'd have to start sharing data across institutions also meaningfully if you wanted to see, like, does this app work across, schools like you, students like you, something like that. And that's probably quite scary to share.
So this idea of sharing data is actually, so there's a whole thing with data security, right, and data privacy that I think sometimes makes these things challenging, but I think it is one thing that people are talking about a lot, right? Even in the context of the study, when you're thinking about all the pilots that are done or the internal research that's done within institutions that nobody's sharing. And there is this conversation about how can we actually share this information in a way that is going to be useful to other people. And part of it is how can we share our information with other people that are like me, who have like the same role. So I'm a CEO at like this higher ed institution, and my friend is a CEO there, and I'd like to share the information on this pilot that I've done. But then there's this idea of getting different stakeholders in the ed tech space to actually like talk to each other and share information and speak the same language, right? That's the thing that's, I think, in some sense challenging. So I don't know that I have an answer, but I definitely think it's a promising idea. And I think there is movements towards trying to figure out ways of bringing these different kinds of people together in order to get them talking about how they can come up with different solutions. It's an early conversation, definitely.
What role do you think faculty want to play in this process? Do you have the time to be involved in the process, or do you just want to be presented the best?
I think it's a very good question. Actually, I have a fundamental question about how we define research here. Because what we do is not really as a doctor, it's not research, it's really evidence-based teaching or using knowledge. I mean, as a practitioner and user, that's what our role. But I think there's some disconnection between researchers and actual users, because we have all the knowledge there, but if we don't use it, what's the use? I mean, but sometimes it's like, as a faculty, knowledge out there, but it's not relevant. And if we don't use it, if we don't have support to use in a small scale kind of, then I think there's a big gap in the whole picture. So that's how I see it. And I mean, luckily we have some support, faculty support, do some pilot studies, and so we can use those kind of evidence to actual teaching and to see student outcomes. But I think we can do a little better. I mean, that's how I do. That's why I came here to see what kind of decision-making process you're going through. I mean, of course, that's all the evidence there. But if we don't talk this to faculty, it's there, then I think it's just kind of, we talk there and then we do this. And so I think that in terms of research, I mean, from nursing standpoint, we always research evidence-based practice and QI. We use that term all the time. Research we see as to generate new knowledge. That's kind of generalized new knowledge. evidence-based practice, evidence-based teaching is the knowledge we're using and that they, based on evidence and then relevance in the population and the setting, all that. And little QI project is really to improve student learning. That's how I see it. And evidence-based teaching is change our practice, how we change our teaching. So we kind of have this separate alignment with the goal of research evidence teaching or learning and the QI. But I think, I don't know, each discipline has different definition about research and all that. But I think this kind of conversation has to occur. Researchers, educational researchers, and also the specific disciplines, how they define research, how they define their practice, what is evidence teaching or learning. So I think we need more communication.
Yeah.